Here we go. All right, so we don't have to make. I feel like I say this every week, and sometimes it's true and sometimes it's not. Because sometimes we end up spending, 45 minutes on these things, and then sometimes we end up spending 15 or 20. But we don't. What I was going to say is we don't have to spend super long on the documents for today. I think a lot of them are pretty self-explanatory. I think they all are really. But it's important context, and especially the way that we'll talk about it today is specifically designed to give you a leg up for the next paper and the exam. Wow, there's an exam coming up in a couple weeks too. Week 10. So anyway, what we're talking about today is we're now firmly entrenched in the modern period. We're now looking at countries, a handful of countries taking over the world in terms of colonialism and imperialism. We grew up with these stories about the brave rebel alliance fights the evil galactic empire, and we glorify the underdogs. And in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the United States is one of maybe 6 or 7 galactic empires that's stretched its tendrils across the world and has kind of taken over, whether by force or economics or by culture, the rest of the planet. So it's uncomfortable to think of us as kind of an empire, but that's what we were and still are. But the famous Dr. Livingstone. If you've ever heard anyone quip like Dr. Livingston, I presume, if you've ever heard that quote, it refers to this guy in the first document for this week. Livingston was this British guy, and he's like the David Attenborough of the imperial period. David Livingstone went into parts of Africa that no Westerner had ever been to and survived. He came out the other side. And he made lots of trips around the world. He kind of documented all this stuff, and he brought awareness of the outside world to the British public. Like David Attenborough and Planet Earth documentaries and, that kind of thing. But in a much more we need to save the rest of the planet. He's not there just to document things. He's like, holy crap, the West is way superior to the rest of the planet, and we need to help these poor schmucks in Africa. So when he says, I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer this, but when Livingston in this document, when he goes to Africa and he's there to spread civilization. What does he mean by spreading civilization exactly? What is he talking about when he's like, we need to bring civilization to Africa? What does he mean by
that? Is he saying just a better way of life than they already have?
Yeah, it's a better way of life. Sorry, I don't know if I could. My volume is just really low. And so I just heard the first part. I didn't mean to cut you off if you had more. Okay.
That was all I had.
Okay. Yeah, better way of life. We need to save Africans from themselves. The West has a superior way of life. What particular does the West have that Africans at this point don't have? What gifts of civilization, and I don't fully believe this, but what gifts of civilization do we need to give these poor third world countries?
The immense technology and superior, basically inventions of the day, even though most of them were ripped off from Eastern Europe, Asia and taken to Europe. And the idea of we're saving their souls, religion, that was a big, at least for the masses, probably not more for the people actually pillaging and raping, but more for the common people. They were oh, we're saving these people's souls.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that what you're gonna? Yeah. Is that what you're getting at, Katie? Um. Okay. Cool. So, yeah, you guys are right. You guys are spot on. You know, the West has invented, whether it's like ripped off, you know, from like pre-existing technology that we claimed as our own, um, things that have been around for a long time, like kerosene or the compass or something like that. Like these are all kind of Middle Eastern inventions. But the West is kind of forging ahead in terms of lots of different technological things. We need to give these people the fruits of modern comfort. You know, the fact that they have to still carry water from some lake or a well miles away to their village is a travesty. We need to intervene in these people's ways of life and make them more like us, you know, with modern day creature comforts and things like that. Some of it's like, okay, fine, you know, like more water, cleaner water, and more accessible. Like that's great. Everybody wants that. But there's things like capitalism that they may not want. You know, like, hey, if you just join this global race to the bottom of producing, you know, the cheapest possible goods for the most amount of consumers, you can be just like us, enlightened people in the West. And you know, I hate to say it, not a lot of people want to sign up for that kind of life voluntarily. And also Christianity, you're right, Nick. So like the evangelizing of not only religion but also the Western way of life in general is what I almost said Attenborough. What David Livingston is getting at here. You know, we need to bring Africa into the modern world, and they'll thank us, and you know we'll be the great saviors of humanity in this way. So along with, I mean, this is kind of an obvious question then. Like, how does he perceive Africans in this speech? Like, how does he look at the African people groups that he comes across? Like, how does he describe them, or what does he think of them? It's kind of a softball question, but. I'm gonna try and find like a specific line. Um, one of the weird things that he does is he kind of conflates. So he says this, and I think this is really interesting. On page 820 at the bottom of the first column, though the natives are not absolutely anxious to receive the gospel, they are open to Christian influences. You know, among these folks, the gospel is well received. It's true missionaries have difficulties to encounter, but what great enterprise was ever accomplished without difficulty? Like, no one ever stopped to think that maybe these folks don't want Western ways foisted upon them. There's absolutely no room here for thinking that maybe these people want to be left alone. Or you know, if you present certain ideas to them as like, hey, you know, like what do you guys, but we believe in this. What do you guys believe? Oh, that's interesting. It's always in the framework of, if these people don't accept what we're offering them, then they are backward and they are lost, and they deserve to be relegated to the dustbin of history. So it's this very paternal, condescending way of looking at the outside world, whether it's Africans or people in Asia or, you know, Aboriginal Australians, whatever. You know, Westerners are always looking at people outside of the West as these poor schmucks. Do you think that still happens today? By the way, do we still have this kind of condescending attitude towards people living in Africa or Asia?
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, look at how we talk about like coronavirus, like our own president calling it the China virus. Like that's that's not completely, politically correct. And just the way we view the Middle East,
Yeah.
like we view it as like basically it's always been a shithole that's been fighting itself, and regardless of our interference, it's always been that way. Or with Africa, it's always been poor, and it has,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the whole shithole country thing lately has really, that quote in recent years has really uh, shed light on a lot of attitudes, of how Americans in general, not just our current leadership, but just how we in the United States view other people, especially as some of them try and come here. Well, it's like, no, you need to stay in your shithole countries. If you're going to be rescued, we will come to you and give you the enlightened ideas of capitalism and Christianity. You stay there. We don't want you here. You stay there. And, and so, yeah, I think you're right, unfortunately. So that's what I'm driving at here. If you will allow me to skip ahead to the Rudyard Kipling poem, The White Man's Burden, that document has a lot in common with how David Livingstone is kind of presenting presenting the West to the rest of the world at the time. I mean, this is an extremely racist poem in a lot of ways. Let me get there. Page 824. What is the white man's burden? Like, can you sum it up? Like, what are we, as the West, supposed to do, the white West? What is the burden of the white races of the world?
Sum it up. I mean, you'd probably say that the burden is that we are so superior, and we're so aware that we're superior, that we must bring the rest of civilization along with us, or we're gonna risk the whole thing dismantling.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, there's this obligation, there's a moral obligation that the white races of the world have to go and tell people what to do. Like, this is giving them, this is the West, and by the West, I'm kind of talking in general about, white industrialized nations, predominantly white. Countries that see themselves as predominantly white in comparison to the rest of the world, which is non-white. And it's this binary kind of view. It's like there's the lightness, there's the light in the world, and there's the darkness. And this is reflected not only in technology and like the divide between like progress and non-progress, but white and dark, white races and dark races. And there's this moral obligation to try and make the darker parts of the world, figuratively and literally, more like the white countries of the West. And if we don't do this, the whole thing is going to fall apart. I'm trying to find the part of the poem where he kind of exemplifies this a little bit. At the very beginning, take up the white man's burden, send forth the best you breed, the most well-bred humans. Good Lord. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen people's half devil and half child. Holy shit. Like, the people that you're encountering in Africa, in Asia, these people are like half devils, like they're so wild, and they're so backward and dumb and uncivilized, simply because they look different than us. They have different cultural norms. They have different levels of technology. Like, the rest of the poem follows this up too. Like, we have to go rescue these people from themselves, these poor schmucks. this is insanely condescending, racist, but this is how people thought in the West. Like, this was the normative way of thinking in the West in the early 1900s, like just 100 years ago, 150 years ago, you know, in that range. And we still kind of think this way too. I'll volunteer a little bit of information. Like, I'm a non-denominational Christian is how I identify myself. I used to be like a hardcore evangelical, like this idea we need to evangelize the rest of the world. And I was part of different churches where they would have mission trips to Haiti or Africa or just different third world, you know, predominantly black parts of the world. And the whole attitude the entire time was like, we need to rescue these people. We need to save them from themselves. And I didn't quite realize just like how ethnocentric that attitude was, how American-centric that attitude was. And it you know, it kind of, I'm not saying there's anything wrong necessarily with religious evangelism, but that paternalistic attitude of these people are so dumb, that was pervasive throughout this entire experience that I was experiencing. And it's kind of hard to look back on. So anyway, there's this blanket attitude that the white races of the world need to uplift. And by the way, that extends not only to just imperialism, but domestic politics in places like the United States as well. You know, look at these poor, dumb African Americans. You know, we need to, they shouldn't have the right to vote because they're not smart enough or intelligent enough. Like, that attitude is just very pervasive. And we're still living with, you know, the after effects of that history. Okay, so the other document too that I want to mention is Fabry, Does Germany Need Colonies? This gives us a slightly different perspective than the other two documents on page 823. Fabry is a writer in Germany. Germany becomes a united nation, and they're trying to decide, you know, should we go and colonize parts of Africa just like the British are doing, just like the French are doing? Like, Germany just became a united country a few years before this. So the great debate within Germany is like, what do we do? Like, now we're a united country, huzzah. Do we need colonies like the other parts of Europe and America? Like, everyone else is building empires, shouldn't we? And Fabry says yes. Germany needs overseas colonies in Africa, in Asia, and they do in fact establish a few colonies overseas, German colonies. But he considers it to be a matter of life or death, a matter of life and death for the development of Germany. Like, if Germany does not get these colonies overseas, if they don't build an empire like the Americans, like the British, like the French, it's a matter of life and death for this new German nation. Why? Like, why does he have this attitude of like, Germany needs to dominate people in Africa, just like everyone else, or we're going to fall apart as a country? Why? What's his rationale there? What do you think this is?
I hate being the only person talking, but I also hate you not having anyone to respond.
I appreciate that.
I think it's probably has something to do with just Germany's past. You know, unlike these other colonial empires, they've been kind of getting trampled for the last like 100 years. You know, things haven't been fantastic in Germany. You know, Napoleon's come through, stuff like that. So I think maybe they could view it as, you know, a form of like equal grounding to kind of ensure that either something like this would be very hard for it to happen again, or like impossible to happen again.
Yeah, we need to become strong enough so we don't get trampled on by our neighbors. You're right. Like, Germany's had a long history of getting its ass kicked by invading French armies or Russians or even the Austrians next door. So we need to build up the strong country to defend ourselves. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? Like, why would Germans feel the need to go out and dominate African territories? Why would that be a matter of life and death?
Wasn't everyone else doing that at the same time?
Yeah, everybody else is doing it. With the implication then, Katie, that I think this is what you're driving at, that if we don't keep up with what the British are doing, what even the Americans, my God, the Americans even have an empire now. If we don't keep up with them, we're going to fall behind. Like, and in a sense, and Fabry doesn't say this outright, but here's what I think. He's concerned that if Germans don't go out and dominate Africans in the way that the British are doing, the French are doing, even the Belgians, and if the Germans aren't out there being one of the dominant white countries, then they're not as civil. That automatically makes them not as civilized as the British, as the French. They're, in other words, they are schlepping off the white man's burden, right? Like if Germany isn't out there telling Africans what to do and what to believe, and hijacking their natural resources and destroying their native ways of life, if they're not doing that, they're not taking up the white man's burden. God looks down upon them and frowns because they're not doing their part in saving humanity from itself. And there's also a practical element of this too. Like he's concerned what practical benefits would Germany have from having a colonial empire, and he mentioned specifically Great Britain, and England. He kind of uses both interchangeably. So kind of page 823 and 824. Anyone who looks at the globe and notes the steadily increasing colonial possessions of Great Britain, how she extracts strength from them, the skill with which she governs them, how the Anglo-Saxon strain occupies a dominant position in the overseas territories, he will begin to see the military argument as the reasoning of a Philistine. So in other words, colonies make a country stronger. And with this kind of Anglo-Saxon element too, like colonies make a race stronger. Like they feed into the bettering of a white race, which is just so creepy to think about, especially in the German context, because 50 years later we get a Nazi regime founded on this belief of the white races. There's a perfect white race, and Germany is like a laboratory building, like compiling the perfect white people. So it's, I don't mean to be depressing on this Friday morning, but this is how people thought not that long ago, really. And there are still strains of this white supremacist way of thinking that stick with us today. And so it's worth knowing where the stuff came from. Like if nothing else today, keep in mind the fact that this stuff, white supremacist Twitter and things that are retweeted by very powerful people, and like just the craziness that's out there today doesn't come from a vacuum. It comes from this historical line of thinking that white people are just simply better than everyone else, and it's our mission to dominate the rest of the world. So, yeah. That's all I got. So this is, yeah, historical roots of white supremacy. It didn't start with the Nazis. It was around long before that. Any questions about anything? Any other questions or comments or anything? Okay. You guys are great. I appreciate you. Thank you for being here. It's just a quiz this week, and then next week we've got another paper. I'm sorry I haven't gotten to your guys' papers yet. I've got a ton to get through. I'm going to try and do that as soon as possible. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Have a great morning. I appreciate you, and I'll see you next week. Have a good weekend. See ya.